room was still, the air thick with unspoken words. I held my breath as Caroline entered, her face a mask of guilt and anguish. Across from her sat Jason, nervously wringing his hands. Their silence screamed louder than any confession could, and my heart thudded in my chest. "Enough!" I slammed the table, my voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I haven't seen the looks, the touches, the lies? How could you? In our home?" Caroline's tears spilled over, but I wasn't done. "You betrayed me, betrayed us, and Jason?" I turned to him, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You've not only destroyed this family, but broken the trust of the one person who called you a brother." As they stammered excuses, I raised a hand. "No. Karma's already begun, and it'll finish what I don't. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this tale, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story." The sun was warm that afternoon, its golden rays bouncing off the gentle waves as they lapped against the shore. Children's laughter rang out as seagulls swooped and dove above, their cries blending into the rhythmic hum of the ocean. For 23 years, I had built this life, a life I thought was everything a man could want, a loving wife, 3 incredible kids, and the kind of stability most men dream of. Standing there on the shoreline, I took in the scene before me. My youngest daughter collecting seashells, my oldest lounging under an umbrella, and my wife, Caroline, laughing as she splashed in the water with our son's best friend, Jason. She looked radiant in the sunlight, her laughter as lively as the waves. I wanted to join her, to feel that same carefree joy, but something held me back. Something off. Jason had been a part of our lives for years, practically a second son to us. Polite, charming, and always eager to help, he was the perfect guest. But that day, as Caroline threw her head back in laughter at something he said, I couldn't shake the feeling that her joy wasn't the kind she usually shared with me. The scene was perfect on the surface. Yet, as I watched her glance at Jason, her eyes lingering just a moment too long, it felt like I was looking at a picture with a crack running through it, a faint, almost imperceptible fissure that only I could see. "Dad?" My son's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "Can you toss us the frisbee?" I grabbed the frisbee from the sand, giving it a lazy toss in their direction. My son caught it mid-air, laughing as he launched it back. Jason joined in, his athleticism impressive, effortlessly keeping up with my son. I couldn't help but notice how easily he fit into the scene. Too easily. As the day wound down, I caught a fleeting moment I couldn't ignore. Jason sat on the sand, his phone in his hand, texting rapidly. Caroline was beside him, her laughter softer now, more private. She leaned in closer than necessary, and when I approached, she quickly straightened up. "Who's that?" I asked, nodding toward Jason's phone. "Just a friend," Caroline said, her tone dismissive. She smiled as if to brush off my concern, but her hand grazed his arm lightly as she laughed again. It wasn't enough to be obvious, but it was enough for me. Something was definitely off. Later that evening, as the family gathered on the patio, the warm scent of grilled food filling the air, I tried to push my unease aside. I looked around the table at the people I loved, searching for reassurance in their familiar faces. Caroline, as always, was the life of the gathering. Her laugh was contagious, her stories animated, drawing smiles and chuckles from everyone, including Jason. She had always been this way, outgoing and vivacious, a natural magnet for attention. It was one of the things I'd fallen in love with. But tonight, there was something different in her energy. She seemed happier than usual, but not with me. Jason, sitting directly across from me, was the perfect guest. He complimented Caroline on the meal, teased the kids good-naturedly, and even helped clear the table when dinner was done. There was nothing outwardly inappropriate, nothing I could put my finger on, and yet it was the little things. His quick glances at Caroline, the way her smile lingered when he spoke. My hearing loss had dulled my ability to catch subtle whispers or the murmur of side conversations, but I didn't need sound to see the way their connection seemed charged. "Dad?" my son said, breaking the quiet I hadn't realized had fallen over me. Jason's coming with us to the disco tonight. Disco? I raised an eyebrow. Yeah, Caroline chimed in, her eyes lighting up. It'll be fun. You should come too. I hesitated, sensing she didn't actually want me to say yes. I'll pass. You all have fun. Jason smiled, a little too eagerly. Thanks for letting me tag along, Mr. Richards. It's always a blast hanging with your family. I forced a polite smile, nodding. Of course. You're like family. The words felt foreign on my tongue. Family? He wasn't mine. As they prepared to leave, I stood in the doorway, watching Caroline slip on her heels. She seemed unusually excited, her energy almost girlish. Jason, waiting by the car, gave her a casual wave. She waved back, her expression softening in a way I hadn't seen in years. Don't wait up, she said, throwing me a quick smile before heading out the door. I watched them drive away, a tightness forming in my chest. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe this was all in my head. But deep down, I knew. Something had shifted in my family, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. The week passed uneventfully, but unease lingered in my mind. Late one evening, as I was heading to bed, I heard Caroline's voice drifting from the living room. Her tone was soft, persuasive, almost playful, the same voice she used when she really wanted something. She spoke rapidly, but focused her attention carefully on my mother, as though trying to discern whether she was being truthful or lying. I paused in the hallway, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. You have to come, she said, her voice low but insistent. It won't be the same without you. Her words hung in the air and I felt my stomach tighten. There was an intimacy to her tone, something that felt out of place. I stepped into the room. She was sitting on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear. The moment she saw me, her posture stiffened. She ended the call quickly, her movements a little too rushed. All right, I'll see you then. Bye. Who is that? I asked, keeping my voice calm. She looked startled, her eyes darting away for a split second before meeting mine. Oh, just a friend, she said, forcing a casual smile. Nothing important. Her answer didn't sit right. Caroline was many things, but a bad liar wasn't one of them. The way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, the faint flush in her cheeks, it was as if she'd been caught in a lie she wasn't prepared for. Who's the friend? I pressed, trying to sound curious rather than accusatory. She shrugged, brushing past me as she headed toward the kitchen. Just someone from work, don't worry about it. Her deflection felt like a dismissal, and it stung, more than I cared to admit. I stood there, rooted to the spot, replaying her words in my mind. That tone, the urgency in her voice, it wasn't how she talked to just anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the doubt had already taken root, and it was growing fast. A few nights later, we went out as a family to a lively downtown disco. Jason joined us, as usual, blending effortlessly into the group. The music was loud, the lights dim and pulsating, and the atmosphere charged with energy. Caroline, who rarely drank more than a glass of wine, was on her second cocktail by the time we arrived. She was radiant under the flashing lights, her movements fluid and uninhibited as she danced. Jason was right there beside her, keeping up with her every step. They laughed, twirled, and moved together in perfect rhythm. It was a sight that should have made me happy. Instead, I sat in the corner nursing my drink, feeling like an outsider in my own life. Her face glowed under the lights, but it wasn't because of me. She hadn't danced with me like that in years, not with that kind of carefree joy. Every smile she gave Jason, every touch on his arm, felt like a dagger in my chest. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was reading too much into things. Maybe this was just harmless fun. Then I heard it. Jason leaned in, his voice carrying over the music. "You're beautiful," he said with a laugh, his tone teasing but sincere. Caroline didn't flinch. She laughed, a little too loudly, and swatted his arm playfully. I froze, my grip tightening around the glass in my hand. It wasn't just the words. It was the ease between them. The kind of ease that comes with familiarity. The rest of the night passed in a blur. They danced until the music slowed, their connection undeniable. I told myself it was innocent, that I was being ridiculous. But the seed of doubt had grown into something much larger, and I could no longer ignore it. By the time we got home, I was certain of one thing. Something was wrong, and I needed to find out the truth. The weekend approached quickly, and the house buzzed with the usual pre-vacation chaos. Bags were scattered across the bedroom floor, clothes folded in neat piles, while Caroline flitted about, her energy electric. She hummed to herself as she packed, occasionally pausing to jot something on a checklist. I sat on the edge of the bed, folding my shirts and watching her out of the corner of my eye. Something about her mood unsettled me. She seemed lighter, more excited than usual, like a teenager preparing for prom, not a mother of 3 heading on a family trip. I shook off the thought and focused on my packing. Then I saw it. A flash of color caught my eye as she reached into her wardrobe. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a bikini I'd never seen before, a bright, revealing piece, far more daring than the modest suits she usually wore. I frowned as she laid it neatly in her suitcase next to her sundresses. "That's new," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She didn't look up, her hands busy folding another dress. "What's that?" "The bikini, it's not your usual style." It made her pause. Her head tilted slightly, and I caught the faintest hesitation before she replied. "Can't a woman feel good about herself?" Her voice was defensive, almost sharp, a stark contrast to the light-hearted mood she'd carried all day. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone even. "It's just, I've never seen you wear anything like that before." She turned to face me, arms crossed over her chest. "Is it so strange that I want to feel confident? I'm not 25 anymore, but I can still look good." The sudden edge in her voice threw me off. "I didn't mean it like that," I said quietly. "I just noticed it's different, that's all." She sighed, shaking her head, and went back to packing. "You're reading too much into it," she muttered, more to herself than to me. But her movements were quicker now, less deliberate, as if she wanted to move past the moment. The tension in the room lingered, thick and heavy. I stayed silent, watching her as she zipped up her suitcase. Her defensive reaction felt disproportionate, almost as if she were hiding something. But before I could press further, she turned to me with a forced smile. "Can you grab the toiletries?" she asked, her tone brighter, as if the exchange had never happened. I nodded and left the room, my mind racing. It wasn't just the bikini. It was everything. Her tone, her defensiveness, the way she seemed more invested in this trip than usual. Something about it didn't add up. As I pulled open the bathroom cabinet, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew the cracks were widening, and soon the truth would find its way through. The soft hum of the ceiling fan stirred the warm night air as I shifted in bed, waking to an odd stillness. The house, usually alive with the faint creaks and sighs of a family asleep, felt eerily quiet. Something wasn't right. My gaze drifted to the alarm clock, 2:47 a.m. Caroline wasn't beside me. The thought jolted me fully awake. My first instinct was to check the bathroom. But the door stood open, the light off. I slipped out of bed, the cool tiles underfoot sharpening my senses. As I moved toward the hallway, a faint, muffled sound reached my ears, a low murmur coming from the living room. The closer I got, the more distinct it became. A voice, then another. Laughter, soft and almost conspiratorial. My stomach tightened. I paused just outside the doorway, peering in. The dim light from a single table lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows. Caroline sat curled on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, wearing a thin wrap that barely covered her shoulders. Jason was seated beside her, his shirt nowhere in sight, leaning back casually, with an arm draped over the cushion. The scent in the room hit me immediately. It was warm, humid, with a hint of something I couldn't quite place, like the lingering traces of intimacy. My pulse quickened. They stopped laughing the moment they noticed me. Caroline straightened abruptly, clutching the edge of her wrap as though trying to pull it tighter. Jason shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "It's late," I said, keeping my voice calm, though it felt like my chest was constricting. "Shouldn't you both be in bed?" Caroline offered a nervous smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We couldn't sleep," she said, her tone too casual. Just watching some TV. I glanced at the television. The screen was black. Jason cleared his throat. Yeah, we, didn't want to wake anyone up, he added, avoiding my gaze. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his unease. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. The disheveled couch cushions, the faint flush on Caroline's cheeks, the way Jason's arm hovered as though he'd pulled it back just in time. Every instinct screamed at me that something was wrong, but I forced myself to stay composed. You should get some rest, I said evenly, addressing them both. It's been a long day. Caroline nodded quickly, almost too quickly. You're right, she said, standing up and tying her wrap more securely. We'll head to bed. Jason mumbled something that sounded like agreement as he grabbed his shirt from the armrest and slipped it on. He didn't meet my eyes as he passed me on his way to the guest room. Caroline lingered for a moment, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her wrap. You coming? She asked, her voice light but forced. I nodded, following her down the hallway. But instead of joining her in our room, I paused outside the door and watched as she slipped inside, her movements hurried, almost panicked. Lena paused to show me the way to the bathroom, and I followed her. Once the door clicked shut, I stood there in the dark, my mind racing. The scene in the living room replayed over and over, each detail amplifying my suspicion. The laughter, the closeness, the undeniable tension that hung in the air, it all pointed to one thing. And yet, I hesitated. I wanted to believe her, to trust her. But the growing weight in my chest told me the truth was far more complicated than I was ready to admit. I returned to bed, lying awake for hours, my thoughts churning. The cracks in my perfect life were no longer subtle, they were glaring, and sooner or later I knew I'd have to confront them head on. The morning sun blazed high as we gathered our things for another day on the beach. The rhythmic crash of waves and the distant calls of seagulls created a peaceful backdrop, but my mind was anything but calm. The events of the previous night played on a loop in my head, each detail digging deeper into my unease. I told myself to let it go, to focus on the moment, but every glance between Caroline and Jason only fueled my growing suspicion. Caroline spread out a towel near the shore, her laughter ringing out as Jason carried an umbrella over his shoulder. He was cracking jokes again, the same way he always did, but today it grated on me. I stayed back, under the pretense of arranging our cooler, my eyes fixed on them from a distance. At first, their interaction seemed harmless enough, light-hearted and friendly. But then I noticed the way she leaned in as he spoke, her laughter lingering longer than it should. She reached out to touch his arm, just briefly, but the gesture sent a jolt through me. It wasn't just the touch. It was how natural it seemed, like an unspoken familiarity between them. My stomach tightened as I watched Jason lean closer, saying something I couldn't hear over the sound of the waves. Caroline laughed again, louder this time, throwing her head back as if he'd told the funniest joke in the world. Her hand remained on his arm a moment too long before she pulled it back, brushing sand from her towel as though nothing had happened. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but the scene wouldn't let me rest. Was I going crazy, I thought, shifting uncomfortably on my towel? Was this just innocent banter, or was there something more? And the kids ran past, their shouts and laughter momentarily pulling my attention away. For a moment, I considered confronting Caroline, asking her outright what was going on. But what would I say? That I didn't like the way she laughed? That I didn't trust the way her hand lingered? Shaking my head, I forced myself to focus on something else. I grabbed a book from the cooler and opened it to a random page, pretending to read. But my gaze kept drifting back to them. Jason had moved closer now, his tone more serious, though I couldn't make out his words. Caroline nodded, her face softening in a way I hadn't seen in years. It hit me then. This wasn't just my imagination. Something had changed, and it wasn't in my favor. Later, as we packed up for the day, I caught Jason handing Caroline her sunglasses. Their fingers brushed briefly, and I saw her smile. Subtle, fleeting, but there. I clenched my jaw, saying nothing, but the knot in my chest tightened. The drive back to the house was quiet. The kids chatted in the back seat, oblivious, while Caroline scrolled through her phone. Jason sat up front beside me, his body relaxed, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, my knuckles turning white. When we arrived, the house felt stifling, despite the air conditioning. I excused myself, retreating to the guest room under the guise of needing a quick rest. But rest was the last thing on my mind. Sitting on the edge of the bed, my thoughts churned. My instincts screamed that I was missing something, that the truth was right in front of me if only I looked closer. And then, like a bolt of lightning, I remembered. The cameras? Weeks ago, I'd installed a few discreet security cameras around the house, mostly to keep an eye on the kids and the property while we were away. It had been a practical decision at the time, something I'd barely thought about once they were up and running. But now, the memory of those cameras brought a sliver of clarity to my spiraling thoughts. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling slightly as I navigated to the app. The feed was there just as I'd left it, capturing every corner of our home. My breath quickened as I scrolled through the saved clips, looking for something, anything, that could confirm my suspicions. I stopped suddenly, my heart pounding. There it was, a timestamp from the previous night. The living room dimly lit. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button. For a moment I considered closing the app, burying my suspicions and pretending everything was fine. But I couldn't. Not anymore. With a deep breath, I pressed play. The house was quiet when we returned from the trip. The kids had gone straight to their rooms, exhausted from days of sand and sun. Caroline busied herself unpacking, her movements light and unbothered, as though the vacation had left her refreshed. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the unease that had clung to me since the beach. As soon as I heard her footsteps retreating down the hall, I slipped into my office, closing the door quietly behind me. My chest felt tight, my breath uneven. I told myself I was only confirming my suspicions, that I might find nothing at all. But deep down, I knew better. There was too much I couldn't explain, too many moments that didn't sit right. My hands trembled as I unlocked my phone, navigating to the security app. The screen illuminated my face, the soft glow casting shadows on the walls. I scrolled through the recent clips, my eyes scanning the timestamps. And then I saw it. A recording from 3 nights ago, the timestamp matching the night of the midnight encounter. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button. Part of me didn't want to know. Ignorance, however painful, still offered the comfort of possibility. But I couldn't turn back now. With a deep breath, I pressed play. The video loaded, showing the dimly lit hallway outside the guest room. At first, it seemed innocuous, an empty space, silent and still. Then Jason appeared, his figure recognizable even in grainy black and white. He moved toward the door, glancing over his shoulder before knocking softly. A moment later, the door opened, and there she was, Caroline. My stomach dropped. She stepped into the hallway, wrapping her arms around herself as though she'd been waiting for him. They spoke in hushed tones, their movements subtle, but the tension was unmistakable. And then, without hesitation, he leaned in. His lips met hers. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away, though every second felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. Her hands rested on his shoulders, not pushing him away, but pulling him closer. It wasn't a fleeting moment, it was deliberate, intimate, and damning. There it was, in grainy black and white, her betrayal. She wasn't just unfaithful, she was cruel. Cruel to kiss him in the home we'd built together, with our children sleeping just a few rooms away. Cruel to make me question everything I thought I knew about her. I watched as she broke the kiss, glancing around nervously before retreating into the guest room. Jason lingered for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob, before slipping inside and closing the door behind him. The screen went dark. I sat there, frozen, the phone still clutched in my hand. The images replayed in my mind, each one sharper and more painful than the last. My heart pounded, not with anger, but with a deep, aching sorrow. The weight of what I'd just seen pressed down on me, suffocating. How long had this been going on? How many nights had I turned over in bed, oblivious, while she snuck off to be with him? The question swirled in my mind, each one more unbearable than the last. I replayed the clip, hoping, absurdly, that I'd missed something, that there was some innocent explanation I hadn't considered, but there was none. The truth stared back at me, undeniable and final. Closing the app, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My world felt as though it had shifted, the foundation cracking beneath me. The woman I'd loved, the partner I'd trusted for over 2 decades, had betrayed me in the most devastating way. And it wasn't just the act itself. It was the deception, the audacity to bring him into our home, to weave lies into the fabric of our family. I thought about confronting her immediately, storming into the bedroom and demanding answers. But what would I say? What could she possibly say that would make this right? The anger surged, hot and blinding, but I pushed it down, knowing I needed a clearer head for what came next. For now, I closed my eyes, letting the silence of the room envelop me. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. Caroline sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair in front of the mirror, her movements calm and methodical. To anyone else, she would have seemed completely at ease, but I could see the faint tension in her shoulders, the small, hurried motions in her routine. She was distracted. I stood in the doorway, watching her silently for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I had spent the night replaying the footage over and over again, hoping for some kind of clarity, but the pain only deepened with each viewing. Now, standing there, I knew there was no more room for doubt, no more pretending everything was fine. "Caroline," I said, my voice low but firm. She turned, startled by the sharpness in my tone. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile faltering. I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. "We need to talk." She set the brush down, turning to face me fully. Her expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Okay. About what?" I took a deep breath, the words heavy on my tongue. "I saw the footage." Her confusion was genuine for a split second, until the realization hit. Her face paled, and her hands dropped to her lap. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen, the damning video queued up. I held it out to her, my hand trembling slightly. "This. Don't lie to me, Caroline. I saw it." Her eyes widened as she stared at the screen, the color draining completely from her face. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't even try to look away. When the video ended, she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she began to sob. "It was a mistake," she choked out between sobs. "I didn't mean for it to happen." I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "A mistake?" I echoed bitterly. "Sneaking around in the middle of the night? Bringing him into our home? How is any of that a mistake, Caroline?" She shook her head, her hands still covering her face. "I don't know. I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I took a step closer, my voice steady but filled with hurt. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her sobs quieting as she struggled to find the words. "A few months," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't believe her. "Don't lie to me, not now." Her hands dropped to her sides, and she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "Years," she admitted, her voice breaking. "It's been years." The air seemed to leave the room. I took a step back, the weight of her words hitting me like a physical blow. Years. It wasn't just a moment of weakness or a fleeting mistake. It was deliberate, calculated, and long-lasting. I stared at her, my mind reeling. "Why, Caroline?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Why would you do this?" She shook her head again, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she said helplessly. "I was lonely. I felt invisible, and Jason, he made me feel seen again." The mention of his name sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. "Jason?" I spat. "He's a kid, our son's best friend. How could you?" Her sobs turned into gasping breaths as she tried to explain. "I didn't plan for this, okay? I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." I stared at her, struggling to process the enormity of her betrayal. "And you expect me to believe that?" I asked bitterly. "That this was some kind of accident?" Her silence was answer enough. I turned away, pacing the room as I tried to gather my thoughts. The anger, the hurt, the humiliation, it all boiled inside me, threatening to erupt. But then her voice cut through the chaos, trembling and hesitant. "It was me," she said softly. I stopped, turning to face her. "What?" She met my gaze, her eyes red and swollen. "I started it," she confessed. "I pursued him. I wanted him." The room seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath my feet. Her words hung in the air, heavy and damning, confirming the one thing I hadn't allowed myself to consider. "You," I trailed off, struggling to speak. "You went after him." She nodded, her head hanging low in shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I've destroyed everything. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never fix." Her apology felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what she had done. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, realizing she was a stranger to me now. The trust, the love, the life we had built together, it was all gone. I turned away, my voice cold and final. "I need some time to think. Don't expect me to forgive you." Without another word, I left the room, the sound of her sobs following me down the hallway. I didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of the truth pressed on me as I gathered the family in the living room. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made even breathing feel like a struggle. Caroline sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were puffy from hours of crying, her guilt etched into every line of her face. The kids sat across from us, oblivious to the storm about to hit, their expressions ranging from curiosity to mild annoyance. At the family meeting, our son James asked, his voice tinged with impatience. At 21, he was the confident, outspoken one, always the first to demand answers. Beside him, our 17-year-old daughter Emma fidgeted nervously, sensing something was wrong. Our youngest Noah sat quietly, his wide eyes darting between us, already picking up on the tension in the room. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. "We need to talk about something important," I began, my words slow and deliberate. "Something that's going to be hard for all of us." James raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Okay, what's going on?" Caroline shifted beside me, her breath hitching. She glanced at me, and I gave her a small nod. This was her confession to make, no matter how much it hurt. The room fell silent, the kids exchanging uneasy glances. Emma's face grew pale, her hands clenching the fabric of her jeans. Noah looked down at his lap, his small shoulders tensing. "What is it, Mom?" James pressed, his tone sharper now. "What did you do?" Caroline's eyes filled with tears, and her voice broke as she spoke. "I've been unfaithful," she said, her words barely audible. "I've been having an affair." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. Then James shot to his feet, his face a mix of shock and fury. "What?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "You're kidding, right?" Caroline shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean," James cut her off, his voice shaking with anger. "You betrayed us. You betrayed Dad. How could you do this?" Emma stared at her mother, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. "Jason?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It was Jason, wasn't it?" Caroline flinched, her silence answering the question. Emma let out a bitter laugh, her tears spilling over. "How could you, Mom?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Jason was family. He was my brother's best friend. How could you do this to us?" The room erupted into chaos. James paced the floor, his hands clenching into fists, while Emma sobbed into her hands. Noah sat frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Caroline tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the fury and heartbreak filling the room. "I don't want to hear your excuses," James snapped, glaring at his mother. "You've destroyed this family. You've ruined everything." Caroline's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I wanted to step in, to somehow ease the pain, but there was nothing I could say to make this better. "I can't be here right now," James said abruptly, his voice cold. He grabbed his keys from the table and headed for the door. "James, wait!" I called after him, but he didn't stop. He turned briefly, his eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "I'm done," he said, his voice firm. "Don't expect me to come back." The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the silent house. Emma let out a fresh sob, curling into herself as Noah stared at the floor, his small hands gripping the edges of his chair. I sank into my seat, the full weight of the moment crushing me. The family I had spent years building was fracturing before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Caroline reached for Emma, but she pulled away, her voice trembling. "Don't. Just don't." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Caroline's muffled cries. I glanced at Noah, his expression unreadable, and realized with a sinking heart that he would never see his mother the same way again. As I sat there, watching the fallout unfold, one thought consumed me. This was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in the days and weeks ahead as we tried to pick up the shattered pieces of our lives, if that was even possible. The days that followed were suffocatingly quiet. The usual sounds of life, the clatter of breakfast dishes, the hum of casual conversation, were replaced by an oppressive silence that filled every corner of the house. Caroline had retreated to the guest room, closing the door on both herself and the rest of the family. Her presence lingered only in faint echoes, the muffled sound of her sobs that seeped through the walls at night, the barely touched meals left outside her door. I didn't know how to feel. The part of me that still cared for her, despite everything, felt a pang of sorrow each time I heard her crying. But it wasn't enough. Not enough to erase the betrayal. Not enough to forgive. I told myself that guilt was her burden to bear. And yet, watching her spiral hurt more than I wanted to admit. Emma and Noah avoided her completely. Emma had moved into her brother's room, refusing to so much as glance at the door to the guest room as she walked past. Noah stayed silent, his bright inquisitive energy dulled into something withdrawn and distant. They had both been robbed of their mother, and I had no idea how to bridge that gap. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the untouched plate of food I'd brought back from Caroline's door, I heard the faint creak of the guest room door opening. Footsteps shuffled into the hallway, hesitant and slow. I turned to see her, hair disheveled, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller, like the weight of her own shame was physically shrinking her. "I'll clean up after myself," she mumbled, her voice barely audible as she reached for a glass of water. She avoided meeting my eyes, her movements quick and purposeful, as though she couldn't stand being in my presence for more than a moment. "Caroline," I said, stopping her as she turned to leave. Her body froze, her back to me, but she didn't respond. "You don't have to lock yourself away," I continued, my tone measured but firm. "This is still your home." She turned slightly, enough for me to see the tears welling in her eyes. "Is it?" she asked softly, her voice cracking. "Because it doesn't feel like it." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. She left before I could reply, retreating back to the room that had become her self-imposed prison. The door clicked shut, and the cycle continued. At night, her cries were the loudest. They echoed through the hallways, raw and unrelenting. Emma would pull a pillow over her head, trying to block it out, while Noah would silently crawl into bed beside me, his small frame trembling. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but the truth was, I didn't believe it myself. Caroline's guilt consumed her. The once vibrant, confident woman I had known seemed to dissolve into a shadow of herself. She barely ate, her untouched plates piling up on the kitchen counter. Her laughter, her energy, the spark that had once defined her, it was all gone. And as much as I resented her for what she had done, seeing her like this wasn't satisfying. It wasn't justice. It was just sad. It was just sad. One afternoon, Emma finally broke the silence. "Why does she even stay here?" she snapped, slamming her textbook shut. "If she's so miserable, why doesn't she just leave?" I looked at her, unsure how to respond. "She's still your mother," I said cautiously. Emma scoffed, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Not anymore, not to me." Her words cut deeper than I expected, and for a moment I felt anger toward Caroline, not just for what she had done to me, but for what she had done to the kids. She had taken something from them that they could never get back, their sense of family, their trust. And no amount of guilt or tears would ever fix that. By the end of the week, Caroline rarely left the guest room. She refused to join us for meals, even when Noah timidly knocked on her door with a plate in hand. She wouldn't look me in the eye when we passed each other in the hallway. She had become a ghost in her own home, haunting the very walls that once held so much joy. I felt sorry for her, but not enough to forget. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, as I sat in the living room, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Days had turned into weeks, and the fragile threads of our family hung by a frayed string. The kids had all but shut their mother out, and Caroline remained a shadow of herself, confined to the guest room with only her guilt for company. But something had to give. I couldn't let this limbo stretch on forever. Not for me, not for the kids, and not for her. Caroline sat across from me now, her face pale, her shoulders hunched, like she was bracing for a storm. She hadn't spoken much, only nodding when I asked her to meet me here to talk. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her once bright eyes dull and lifeless. "I've been thinking," I started, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "About everything." She nodded again, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. "I understand," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Do you?" I asked, the question more pointed than I intended. "Do you really understand what you've done, what you've put this family through?" Her breath hitched, tears forming in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I know I've destroyed everything, and I know I don't deserve a second chance. But if there's any way at all, I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment I studied her, trying to gauge if she truly meant them or if they were just another hollow promise. "Fixing this," I said slowly, "isn't just about me. It's about the kids. They've lost something they might never get back, and that's on you." She nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "I know," she choked out. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. "If we're going to try, and I mean try, then there are rules, no room for negotiation." She swallowed hard, her eyes locked on mine. "Anything," she said earnestly. "I'll do anything." "You cut all ties with him," I said firmly. "No calls, no texts, no contact of any kind. He's out of your life completely." She nodded without hesitation. "He's already blocked. I'll never speak to him again." "And therapy," I added. "Both individual and couples. If we're going to stand a chance, we need help, professional help." "Yes," she said quickly, her voice trembling, "whatever it takes." I leaned back, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the hope that this could be salvaged. But another part, the part still raw and bleeding from her betrayal, remained skeptical. Could I ever truly trust her again? Could I ever look at her without seeing the lies? "I'm not promising anything," I said finally, my tone hard. "This is a probation period, Caroline. You have a lot to prove, and I can't guarantee I'll ever be able to forgive you completely. But for now, for the sake of the kids, we'll try." Her sobs broke free at my words, and she covered her face with her hands. "Thank you," she whispered between gasps. "Thank you for giving me a chance." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My emotions were too tangled, too raw to offer her the comfort she sought. I stood up instead, signaling that the conversation was over, and walked away, leaving her to sit alone in her grief. The first therapy session came 2 days later. I sat stiffly in the chair across from the therapist, Caroline beside me, her gaze fixed on the floor. The therapist, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, began by asking us to share why we were there. I let Caroline speak first, her voice shaky as she recounted the affair, her guilt, and her desire to rebuild. When it was my turn, I laid everything bare. The betrayal, the anger, the uncertainty of whether I could ever forgive her. It wasn't easy, but I didn't hold back. If this process was going to work, there could be no half-truths, no sugarcoating. Then the therapist asked Caroline a question that made my stomach drop. When did your feelings for Jason begin? Caroline hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I'm not sure, she said, her voice barely audible. Be honest, the therapist prompted gently. It's important to acknowledge the timeline. Caroline looked up at me, her eyes filled with fresh tears. It wasn't just the past couple of years, she admitted. It started earlier, much earlier than I let on. I think I started noticing him, feeling something, when he was still in high school. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Jason had been 17 then, barely more than a boy. My mind reeled, the revelation twisting the knife already lodged in my heart. This wasn't just an affair. It was a pattern, a long-brewing obsession that had taken root years before I even realized there was a problem. I said nothing, the room spinning as the therapist guided us back to the session. But inside, the doubts multiplied. Could I ever forgive her? And more importantly, could I ever trust her again? Only time would tell. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. It wasn't the suffocating stillness of shock or despair, but something closer to contemplation. The kids were in their rooms, trying to move forward in their own ways. Caroline was in the guest room, likely journaling or reflecting as the therapist had suggested. And I was alone in the living room, staring at the framed family photos lining the mantel. Each picture told a story. Vacations, holidays, ordinary moments captured in fleeting smiles. I picked up one of us on a beach years ago. Caroline was laughing, her arms around the kids, while I stood slightly apart, holding a drink, content to watch from a distance. It had been one of the happiest days of my life, though now I wondered if it had been for her. She broke my trust, I murmured, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. But maybe trust can be rebuilt, or maybe it's just gone forever. That was the truth of it, wasn't it? Trust was the foundation of any relationship, and ours had been shattered. Rebuilding it felt as daunting as piecing together shattered glass. You could try, but the cracks would always be there, visible and sharp. Yet, part of me wanted to try, if only for the sake of the family we'd built together. But did I want it enough? I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking under my weight, and closed my eyes. My mind drifted to the early days of our marriage. We'd been so young then, so full of hope and certainty that we could face anything, as long as we were together. Caroline's laugh had been my favorite sound in the world, and I had believed in us with every fiber of my being. Now, that certainty was gone, replaced by doubt and fear. Could I ever look at her without remembering the betrayal? Could I let go of the images burned into my mind, her with Jason, the lies, the hurt? Forgiveness felt like a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb, but bitterness wasn't the life I wanted to live either. As the hours passed, I found myself thinking less about the betrayal and more about resilience. Pain, after all, was part of life. It could break you if you let it, but it could also shape you into something stronger. Maybe this wasn't about Caroline. Maybe this was about me. What kind of man I wanted to be. What kind of example I wanted to set for my kids. I stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet street, bathed in the soft glow of street lights. The air was still, the kind of stillness that invites reflection. My mind turned to the therapist's parting words. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let anger define your life. I wasn't sure I was ready to forgive, but I knew I didn't want to live consumed by anger. The affair had taken so much already, my trust, my sense of stability, the image of the life I thought I had. But it wouldn't take everything. I wouldn't let it. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. Not to what we once had, but to something new. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and a willingness to rebuild from the ashes. And even then, it might not work. But at least I'd know I'd tried. As I returned to my chair, I thought about the kids. They needed stability now more than ever. They needed to see that life doesn't end when things fall apart, that resilience isn't about pretending everything is okay, but about finding the strength to move forward anyway. Caroline's betrayal would always be a scar, but scars, I realize, don't define you. They remind you of what you've endured, what you've survived. And in time, they become a testament to your strength. I picked up the photo again, this time focusing on the kids' faces. Their bright smiles, their unguarded joy. They were my reason to keep going, my reason to try. Not for Caroline and not for the life we once had, but for them. For myself. Time would tell if trust could be rebuilt, if forgiveness could take root. But for now, I was willing to take the first step. Not for her, but for me. Setting the photo back on the mantle, I let out a long breath. The road ahead would be uncertain, filled with challenges I couldn't yet foresee. But one thing was clear. I wasn't broken. Not completely. And as long as there was strength in me to fight for the life I wanted, I wasn't finished yet.